I was trying on a new bra when my nephew walked in. But what if that one moment wasn't just awkward? It was the spark that ignited a storm of emotions neither of us was prepared to face. When a fleeting glance turns into something deeper, and an innocent mistake changes everything. How do you navigate the line between what's right and what feels impossible to deny? Join me as I unravel this unforgettable story of temptation, restraint, and the consequences of forbidden emotions. Don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from today. I was adjusting the strap of my new bra in the mirror when the door creaked open. My nephew stood there frozen, and the look on his face told me that this was a moment neither of us would forget. The house had been unusually quiet that afternoon. My husband Mark was away on another one of his endless business trips. It was something I had grown used to over the years. Our marriage had been a comfortable, if distant, routine. I had taken the day off to run errands and indulge in a little shopping spree. Among my purchases was the new lace bra I was now admiring in the bedroom mirror. I adjusted the straps, turning side to side to see how it fit. The soft lavender lace was delicate, feminine, and, if I was being honest, a little indulgent. It wasn't the kind of thing Mark would notice, but I had bought it for myself. For a rare moment of feeling beautiful and confident. And then it happened. The bedroom door creaked open, and before I could react, my nephew Jason was standing there. He froze, his hand still on the doorknob, eyes wide with shock. I grabbed for the nearest robe, fumbling to cover myself. "Jason," I managed to gasp, my voice a mix of surprise and embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" He stammered, his cheeks turning a deep crimson. I didn't know you were in here. The door wasn't locked and I'm sorry." I clutched the robe tightly around me, my heart racing as the weight of the moment pressed down. Jason finally tore his gaze away and backed out of the room, muttering another hurried apology before shutting the door behind him. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my face burning with humiliation. How could I have been so careless? But beneath the embarrassment, there was another emotion, something I didn't want to name. It was pain. It was alone. Jason had only been living with us for a few weeks, a temporary arrangement while he completed an internship in the city. He was 22, charmingly awkward, and had the kind of youthful confidence that seemed to light up a room. It had been years since I'd spent time around someone so vibrant and full of life, and I couldn't deny that his presence had brought a liveliness to the house that had been missing for a long time. That evening, I avoided him as much as I could. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing dinner with more focus than necessary. When Jason finally appeared, he was quiet, his usual chatter replaced by a hesitant politeness. "Do you need any help?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "No, it's fine," I replied, not looking up from the cutting board. "Everything's almost done." We ate in near silence, a stark contrast to the easy conversations we'd had in the past weeks. Mark's absence had always left a void at the dinner table. But tonight, the tension between Jason and me made the emptiness feel oppressive. After dinner, Jason cleared his throat. "Aunt Rachel, about earlier. I just wanted to say I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to—" "Aunt Rachel—" "It's fine," I interrupted, forcing a smile. "Let's just forget about it, okay?" He nodded, but the awkwardness lingered. As the evening wore on, I found myself stealing glances at him. There was something in his eyes, a mix of shame and something else that I couldn't quite place. It was unsettling and intriguing all at once. Over the next few days, we both tried to act as if nothing had happened. Jason kept himself busy with his internship, and I threw myself into work and household chores. But no matter how much I tried to push the incident from my mind, it lingered. It wasn't just the memory of him walking in, it was the way he had looked at me. For a brief moment, his gaze had been raw and unguarded, and it had ignited something deep within me, something I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, I found myself in the living room, folding laundry while a mindless sitcom played in the background. Jason walked in, carrying a stack of books and his laptop. He hesitated for a moment before sitting on the couch opposite me. "Need some help?" he offered, gesturing to the pile of clothes. I shook my head. "I've got it, but thanks." He set his things down and leaned back, watching the TV with a distracted expression. After a few minutes, he spoke. "Can I ask you something?" She sighed and she said, "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Do you ever regret things?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the screen. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze finally meeting mine. "I don't know. Just decisions you've made, things you wish you could do differently." He paused, the weight of his words settling over me. "I think everyone has regrets," I said carefully, "but the important thing is to learn from them and move forward." Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I guess that makes sense." The conversation hung in the air, charged with an undercurrent I couldn't quite define. For the first time since the incident, I felt a strange sense of connection with him, a shared vulnerability that made me both uneasy and exhilarated. Later that evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen, Jason walked in again. He leaned against the counter, watching me with a look that was both familiar and disarming. I felt my chest quiver. "You work too hard," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I laughed softly, trying to mask the nervous flutter in my chest. Someone has to keep this place running. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a gentle murmur. "You know, you don't always have to be the one holding everything together." I froze, his words cutting deeper than I expected. For a moment, I felt exposed, as if he could see through the carefully constructed facade I had built over the years. I forced a smile and turned back to the sink. "Life doesn't really give you a choice sometimes," I said, keeping my tone light. Jason didn't respond. Instead, he stayed where he was, his presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the tension that had been simmering between us since that fateful afternoon. The tension between Jason and me hadn't dissipated. If anything, it grew thicker with each passing day. I caught myself overanalyzing every interaction, wondering if I was imagining things. Was the strange undercurrent in our conversations real, or was it just my own restless mind creating something out of nothing? One evening, Mark called from yet another hotel room, the faint sounds of a sports game playing in the background. "How's everything back home?" he asked, his tone as neutral as ever. "Fine," I replied, glancing out the window at the sunset. "Jason's been keeping himself busy with his internship." "Good," Mark said. "It's nice that he's staying with you. I'll be home in a couple of weeks." I didn't bother asking if he missed me. I already knew the answer. Mark wasn't a bad husband, but he had a way of making me feel like a distant obligation, a piece of furniture he appreciated but rarely noticed. As I hung up the phone, a wave of frustration washed over me. It wasn't just about Mark. It was about everything: the monotony, the loneliness, the feeling that life was slipping by without any real spark. Later that night, I was curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, a movie playing softly on the TV. Jason walked in, his hair slightly damp from a shower, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. He hesitated in the doorway, and for a moment, I thought he might turn around and leave. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Of course not," I said, patting the empty cushion beside me. He sat down, keeping a respectable distance, but I could feel the warmth of his presence. We watched in silence for a while, the only sound the faint dialogue from the screen. I sipped my wine, trying to focus on the movie, but my thoughts kept drifting. "This is nice," Jason said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I turned to look at him. "What is?" "Just spending time together. I don't think we've ever really done this before." His words caught me off guard. He wasn't wrong. Jason had always been more of a background figure in my life. A polite, well-mannered nephew I saw at family gatherings but never really got to know. Now, sitting beside him, I realized how little I actually knew about him. "It is nice," I admitted, offering a small smile. "You've grown up a lot, Jason." He chuckled, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. "I guess so. It's weird being back here, though. It feels like I'm a kid again. But I'm not." The way he said it, with a quiet vulnerability, made my chest tighten. I reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not a kid," I said softly. "You're a man now." The words hung in the air, and I realized too late how they might have sounded. Jason's eyes flickered to mine, his expression unreadable. I pulled my hand back quickly, taking another sip of wine to cover my unease. The next day, I decided to keep myself busy. I spent the morning cleaning out the attic, a project I had been putting off for months. Jason offered to help, and despite my initial hesitation, I agreed. We spent hours sorting through old boxes, laughing at the ridiculous fashion choices and old photos, and reminiscing about family memories. "You were such a cute kid," I teased, holding up a photo of a young Jason grinning with a missing front tooth. "Don't let that fool you," he said, grinning. "I was a terror back then." We were sitting on the floor, surrounded by a sea of boxes and forgotten relics. The mood was light and easy, and for a moment it felt like things were back to normal. But then, as I reached for another box, our hands brushed. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me. I looked up and Jason was already watching me. "Rachel," he said, his voice low. He only ever used my name when we were alone. It was always Aunt Rachel in front of others. The way he said it now, with a quiet intensity, made my breath catch. "Yes?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not," I said quickly, too quickly. Jason gave me a small, knowing smile. "You're a terrible liar." I laughed nervously, looking away. "Maybe, but we don't need to talk about this, okay? It was just a misunderstanding." "Was it?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I stood up, brushing dust off my jeans. "I think we've done enough for today." Jason didn't press the issue, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked down the attic stairs. That evening, the tension reached a breaking point. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Jason walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me in silence. Finally, he spoke. "She sick?" Do you ever think about what your life could have been like if you'd made different choices? The question caught me off guard, and I paused, the knife still in my hand. I think everyone wonders about that sometimes, I said carefully. Why do you ask? Jason shrugged, but his expression was serious. I just feel like you're not happy. You don't have to say it, but I can see it. His words cut deeper than I expected, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. It's not that simple, I said finally, setting the knife down. Life isn't always about being happy. Sometimes it's about doing what's right. Jason stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. What if what's right doesn't make you happy? I turned to face him, my heart pounding. He was standing so close, too close. I could see the faint stubble on his jawline, the way his eyes searched mine for an answer I didn't have. Jason, I said, my voice shaking slightly, we can't. This isn't. I know, he interrupted, his tone both firm and gentle. I'm not trying to make things harder for you. He broke off, running a hand through his hair. I can't pretend I don't feel something, and I don't think you can either. His words left me speechless. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Then, as if realizing he had crossed a line, Jason stepped back. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I shouldn't have said that. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my mind racing. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jason's words echoing in my mind. He was right. I wasn't happy. But acknowledging that felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to face. The house was silent, save for the faint creak of floorboards. I thought I was imagining it at first, but then I heard a soft knock at my bedroom door. My heart leapt into my throat. Rachel? Jason's voice was a quiet murmur. I sat up, my pulse racing. What is it? The door opened slightly, and Jason stepped inside. He looked as uneasy as I felt, but there was a determination in his eyes that made me hold my breath. I wanted to say goodnight, he said, his voice trembling slightly. And to make sure you're okay. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Jason lingered for a moment, his gaze holding mine. Then, without another word, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. As I lay back down, I realized something that both terrified and thrilled me. This was no longer just an innocent misunderstanding. It was something much more complicated, and I had no idea where it would lead. The days following Jason's late-night visit were a haze of confusion and unspoken tension. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind, the way his voice trembled, the look in his eyes as he stepped into my room. It was innocent enough on the surface, but the undercurrent of something forbidden lingered. I threw myself into chores, errands, anything to keep busy. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, Jason's presence was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental brush of our hands seemed charged with a new, unsettling energy. One afternoon, I was in the garden pruning the roses. The sun was high and the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. Jason appeared on the porch, a glass of iced tea in his hand. He walked over, his easy smile disarming. Thought you could use this, he said, handing me the glass. Thanks, I replied, taking a sip. The cool liquid was a welcome relief, but his proximity set my nerves on edge. Jason crouched beside me, his eyes scanning the garden. You've got a real green thumb. Everything looks amazing. It's just a hobby, I said, keeping my focus on the roses. Something to pass the time. He didn't respond immediately, and when I finally glanced at him, he was watching me with that same quiet intensity that had haunted me since the day he walked into my room. You deserve more than just passing the time, he said softly. I looked away, the weight of his words settling over me. Jason, I'm sorry, he interrupted, standing abruptly. I didn't mean to make things weird again. You're not, I said quickly, though the truth was far more complicated. I don't know how to handle this. I understand. He nodded, his expression a mix of frustration and understanding. Neither do I. For a moment we stood there in the garden, the distance between us feeling both too much and not enough. That evening I decided to host a small dinner. It was an attempt to normalize things, to bring some lightness back into the house. I spent hours in the kitchen, preparing Jason's favorite dishes. When he came in, the smell of garlic and herbs filling the air, he gave me an approving smile. This looks amazing, he said, leaning against the counter. It's nothing fancy, I replied, brushing off the compliment. Jason stepped closer, his tone teasing. Don't sell yourself short. You've outdone yourself. I laughed, the sound lighter than I felt. Maybe I just needed a project. As we ate, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in days. We talked about his internship, his plans for the future, and the places he wanted to travel. For a while, it felt like the tension had lifted, replaced by the kind of bond I had always hoped to have with him. But then, as we cleared the table, Jason reached for the same plate I was holding. Our hands touched, and neither of us pulled away. His eyes met mine, and in that moment the air between us shifted again. Rachel, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Can I ask you something? Yeah. I swallowed hard, nodding. What is it? Do you ever think about us? His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I stepped back, the plate slipping from my hands and landing on the counter with a soft clatter. Jason, we can't. I know, he interrupted, his tone earnest. I know we can't, but that doesn't stop me from feeling it. I stared at him, my heart pounding. This isn't right, I said, my voice trembling. We can't go down this road. Jason nodded, his expression conflicted. I know, but I don't think I can pretend anymore. The following day, I decided to create some space between us. I spent most of the day in my room, catching up on work and avoiding the living room where Jason usually hung out. But by evening, the solitude became unbearable. I ventured downstairs, only to find Jason sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. Hey, he said, setting the remote down. I thought you were avoiding me. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I just needed some time to think. And then I hesitated again. About what? He asked, his tone light but probing. I sat down in the armchair across from him, keeping a safe distance. About everything. About how complicated this has all become. Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Rachel, I don't want to make your life harder. I care about you. More than I probably should. His honesty took my breath away, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Finally, I managed, "I care about you too, Jason. But that's why this has to stop. We can't risk crossing a line we can't come back from." Jason nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I get it, but it's not easy. It's not supposed to be," I said softly. "Doing the right thing rarely is." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but my mind was anything but. Jason's words echoed in my head, along with my own conflicted feelings. I had always thought of myself as a moral person, someone who valued loyalty and integrity. But now, those ideals felt fragile, easily shattered by the weight of unspoken desires. The faint sound of footsteps broke through my thoughts. I held my breath, listening as they grew closer. Then, a soft knock at my door. "Rachel?" Jason's voice was tentative, barely audible. I sat up, my heart racing. "What is it?" The door creaked open, and Jason stepped inside. He looked unsure, almost hesitant, but there was a determination in his eyes that made me hold my breath. I couldn't sleep," he admitted, standing in the doorway. I gestured for him to come in, unsure of what else to do. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I don't even know if I want to." His honesty left me speechless. I reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jason, this isn't something we can fix. It's something we have to let go." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. "What if I don't want to let go?" My hand dropped to my lap, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Then we'll only make things worse. For both of us." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room was filled with a charged silence, the unspoken tension between us more palpable than ever. Finally, Jason stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." He turned and walked out, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and conflicted heart. As I lay back down, I realized that no matter how hard we tried, this was a line we couldn't keep dancing around forever. Sooner or later, something would have to give. The following morning, the tension between Jason and me had reached its peak. Every glance, every accidental touch seemed to pull us closer to the edge of something neither of us dared to name. I told myself it was just a phase, a fleeting moment of confusion that would pass if I ignored it long enough. But deep down, I knew better. The house was quiet again that afternoon. Jason had gone out for a morning run, and I took the opportunity to immerse myself in a good book, hoping to distract my restless mind. But when I heard the front door open and the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, my heart skipped a beat. "Rachel?" he called out, his voice warm and familiar. "In here," I replied, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. Jason appeared in the doorway, his hair damp with sweat and his t-shirt clinging to his chest. He held a water bottle in one hand, his breathing still uneven from the run. "Busy?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just killing time," I said, setting it aside. "How was the run?" "Good," he replied, stepping into the room. "Needed to clear my head." His words hung in the air, and I realized he wasn't just talking about the run. I offered a small smile, unsure of what to say. Jason sat down on the armchair across from me, his eyes scanning the room before finally settling on mine. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone hesitant but resolute, "about everything." I didn't respond immediately, waiting for him to continue. His gaze didn't waver, and I could see the storm of emotions swirling just beneath the surface. "I know we've tried to pretend everything's normal," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But it's not, and I don't think it ever will be." "Jason," I began, my voice faltering. "We can't—" "I'm not asking for anything," he interrupted gently. I need to be honest about how I feel." His words sent a jolt through me, and I felt my defenses crumbling. I wanted to stop him, to tell him that some things were better left unsaid, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. "I know it's wrong," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't help it. I care about you, Rachel, more than I should." The room felt impossibly small, the weight of his confession pressing down on me. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could move past this, but the words caught in my throat, because part of me knew I felt the same way. That evening, the power went out. It had been a hot, humid day, and a sudden summer storm rolled in just as the sun was setting. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for a flashlight, the flickering beam casting long shadows on the walls. Jason appeared in the living room holding a candle. The warm glow illuminated his face, softening his features and making the tension between us feel even more intimate. "Looks like we're in for a long night," he said, his voice low and steady. I nodded, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "I guess so." We sat together on the couch, the candlelight flickering between us. The storm raged outside, but the silence in the room was almost deafening. I could feel Jason's eyes on me, and I fought the urge to meet his gaze. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm not," I replied, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "You are," he said softly, "and I get it, but I would never do anything to hurt you." His words struck a chord, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "It's not about that, Jason. It's about everything else." "I know," he said, his tone laced with regret. "I just wish things were different." For a moment, the only sound was the rain pelting against the windows. Then, without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on his. The contact was electric, and I felt my heart racing as he turned his hand to clasp mine. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his gaze locked on mine, "but that doesn't change how I feel." The room seemed to close in around us, the storm outside a distant echo. I knew I should pull away, create the distance we so desperately needed, but I couldn't bring myself to move. "Yeah." Jason leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice filled with a raw vulnerability that made my heart ache. Before I could respond, a loud crash of thunder shook the house, startling us both. I pulled my hand away, the spell between us broken. Jason leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. "Good night, Rachel." "Good night," I replied, my voice barely audible. As he walked away, I felt a wave of relief and regret in equal measure. The line we had been dancing around for weeks had been pushed to its limit, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. The next morning, Jason was gone. I found a note on the kitchen counter, his neat handwriting scrawled across the page. "Rachel, I needed to clear my head, so I went for a drive. Don't worry, I'll be back later tonight." Jason? I stared at the note, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. His absence was both a relief and a reminder of how much our lives had shifted in such a short time. I spent the day in a daze, going through the motions but unable to shake the memory of the night before. When Jason finally returned that evening, he seemed calmer, more composed. But there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. We exchanged polite conversation over dinner, avoiding any mention of the storm or the moments we had shared. But the unspoken tension lingered, a constant reminder of the line we had nearly crossed. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that the feelings we had been trying to suppress weren't going to disappear. They were a storm of their own, building in intensity with every passing day. And no matter how much we tried to deny it, the pull between us was impossible to ignore. Something had to change. Would you like me to continue with the final 1,500 words? You said, climax and resolution, 1,000 words. ChatGPT said, Part 5, climax and resolution, 1,000 words. The tension between Jason and me came to a head the next evening. It was quiet in the house. Too quiet. Mark had called earlier to tell me his trip would be extended another week. The news left me with a familiar pang of disappointment, though I wasn't sure if it was for his absence or for the relief it brought. Jason had been distant all day, retreating to his room and barely saying a word. Part of me wanted to confront him, to bring everything out into the open, but another part was too scared of what might happen if I did. That night, I decided to go for a walk in the garden. The cool air was a welcome escape from the oppressive atmosphere inside. I wandered along the stone path, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. The moonlight cast a silvery glow over everything, making the garden feel like another world entirely. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Jason standing at the edge of the path. His hands were in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Couldn't sleep? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He shook his head, stepping closer. I needed some air. We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between us palpable. Finally, Jason spoke. Lee, Rachel, we need to talk. I braced myself, my heart pounding. About what? You know what? He said, his tone gentle but firm. This, whatever it is between us, we can't keep pretending it's not there. I looked away, my chest tightening. Jason, it's not that simple. It is, he insisted, taking another step closer. We either face it, or we let it destroy us. His words struck a chord, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. And then what? What happens if we face it? What happens to everything else? Jason reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The contact sent a shiver through me, but I didn't pull away. The boy released me as the others began to raise their visors. I don't know, he admitted, his voice trembling. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. It's tearing me apart. I looked up at him, my heart breaking at the raw emotion in his eyes. Jason, I care about you. More than I should. But this, it's wrong. Why? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Because people say it is? Because we're afraid of what might happen? Soon, because it would hurt too many people, I said, my voice cracking, including us. Jason nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground. I get it. I do. But that doesn't make it any easier. No, I agreed, my voice barely audible. It doesn't. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, Jason stepped back, his expression filled with a quiet resignation. "I think I should leave," he said softly. "Maybe it's the only way we can move past this." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do," he said, his voice firm, "for both our sakes." The next morning, Jason packed his bags. I stood in the doorway of his room, watching as he folded his clothes and placed them in his suitcase. The sight was almost too much to bear. We held each other's gaze for a long time. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I'll stay with a friend," he said without looking up. "Finish my internship from there." I nodded, unable to find the words to express what I was feeling. When he finally zipped up his suitcase and turned to face me, the look in his eyes nearly broke me. "Rachel," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "I hope you know how much you mean to me. This isn't about running away. It's about doing what's right." I felt tears streaming down my face as I nodded. "I know. And I'm sorry for everything." "Don't be," he said, stepping closer. "I'll always be grateful for the time we had, even if it wasn't what either of us expected." He leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead. It was a goodbye, but it carried the weight of everything we couldn't say. When he pulled back, I could see the pain in his eyes, mirroring my own. As Jason drove away later that day, I stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the street. The house felt unbearably empty, and I realized how much his presence had filled the void that Mark's absence had left behind. But as much as it hurt, I knew Jason was right. His leaving was the only way we could begin to heal. Over the following weeks, life returned to its usual rhythm. Mark came home, oblivious to the emotional storm that had passed through our house. I threw myself into work, trying to find solace in the familiar routines of daily life. But every now and then, I would catch myself thinking of Jason. His smile, his laugh, the way he had looked at me that night in the garden. The memories were bittersweet, a reminder of what could never be. One evening, I received a text from him. "Rachel, I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted to let you know I'm fine. I'm staying busy and trying to move forward, but I think about you often. Thank you for everything." And so on. I stared at the message for a long time, my heart aching with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Finally, I replied, "I'm glad to hear you're doing well. Take care of yourself, Jason. You'll always have a place in my heart." As I hit send, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was the one we needed. Jason and I had shared something fleeting, something that could never last. And while it had left a scar, it had also reminded me of my capacity to feel deeply, to love, even when it was complicated and painful. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that set us free. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened with Jason. The house felt quieter now, and not just because he was gone. It was the absence of that unspoken tension, the silence where our charged conversations used to linger. I had once feared what his presence might mean for my life, but now I realized it wasn't Jason who had unsettled me. It was what he had awakened in me. He had forced me to confront truths I had long buried, truths about my marriage, my happiness, and the parts of myself I had forgotten. Jason wasn't the problem. He was a symptom of something deeper, a longing for connection, for passion, for a life that felt truly lived. Mark's presence, though familiar, no longer offered the comfort it once had. I found myself questioning whether the life we had built together was one I wanted to keep building. Jason's departure wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. A chance to rediscover who I was and what I wanted. And while I would always carry the memories of Jason with me, I knew that moving forward meant letting go, not just of him, but of the parts of myself I had outgrown.